Hello, my name is Kelly Tebow, and I am with the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders. I will be your organizer for this evening and would like to welcome you to our webinar on grief and loss. Thank you all for joining us. Before I have my colleague introduce the speaker for tonight, I'm going to cover some housekeeping items with you. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please type it in the bottom of your question box and click send. You may send questions during the webinar. However, we will have Jessie answer the questions at the end of his presentation. We will get to as many questions as time allows. And in addition, tonight's presenter is available to take your questions on the Wednesday webinar blog, which is accessed from our homepage under the heading Programs. This blog will be monitored for the next 7 days. Feel free to look and post questions as often as you like. Answers will be archived for future reference. If you missed any part of this presentation or would just like to watch it again, an archived version will be posted to the website shortly. We value your input, and in order to expand the webinar experience in the future, we need everyone to fill the survey out as you exit the webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees, assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now, I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the webinar coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Thanks, Kelly, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar on grief and loss. Jessie Bassett, tonight's presenter, grew up in Washington State and earned his Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. His studies were focused on ethics, spirituality, and counseling. Jessie is the Director of Education at the Good Grief organization located in Morristown, New Jersey, where they are working to transform the environments in which grieving children have to navigate daily. Good Grief has developed workshops, curriculum, and coaching programs to increase community awareness in providing support to grieving children and their families. Jessie, welcome to our Wednesday webinar family. And now, without further introduction, I'm pleased to turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you, Kelly, for the introduction. And good evening, everybody. My name is Jessie Bassett, and I'm the Director of Education for Good Grief. And I'm going to go into a little bit here about the organization to share with you a little bit more information about who we are. But a little bit of background about myself first before we get started this evening. As Marty already mentioned, I grew up out in Washington State. Actually grew up in a small rural farm town. And I was raised by two parents who were actually grieving kids themselves. So my dad's dad died when he was 9 years old, and my mom's dad died when she was in her mid-20s. And the impact, I think, on that in terms of my growth and development as a person has really stuck with me. I had lots of experiences as a young person kind of going around with my dad on his different trips. We would talk a lot about death and grief and loss, and same with my mom. It was always an important part of the family conversation. And when I went off to college, I wasn't really sure what I was going to study, so I ended up studying philosophy because what else do you study if you're not sure what to study and what you're going to do with your life? And I kind of fell in love with philosophy, and that took me on to graduate school, where I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, as Marty already mentioned. And there I had the great opportunity to study ethics and end-of-life care, along with some pastoral care and counseling. And during that time, I got the opportunity to intern at this organization called Good Grief that I kind of stumbled upon. And that's when my background, my childhood, my upbringing, along with my education kind of came together in a really unique way, and I kind of fell in love with the organization. And I was very fortunate to get to be hired by the organization during my last year of graduate school and stayed and have been with the organization ever since. And I started working on our program team, working directly with families, facilitating groups with 6- and 7-year-olds in our middle school group, and then have since moved into this role as Director of Education in the last year or so here. So I'm excited to be with you this evening and to have this conversation about grief and loss and handling expectations. A little bit about the organization. Good Grief's mission is to provide free and unlimited support to grieving children, teens, young adults and their families after the death of a parent, primary caregiver, sibling, or child through peer support programs, education, and advocacy. Good Grief has been around since 2004, and it was started by a group of concerned folks in the community who recognized that there was a need for grieving children to receive support and education, for their needs to be advocated for in places like schools and nonprofits and all the environments that kids inhabit. And not hard to imagine in a post 9/11 world that there are going to be a lot of grieving kids in our communities. And so these folks kind of rallied together to start the organization. By 2011, we moved out of a small church in Summit where we were operating our programs to Morristown to occupy our own center. And by 2012, we expanded down to Princeton, New Jersey, after a number of families who were driving up from Mercer County said that they wanted to help us to start a new program down in Princeton to help families in this area receive support as well. So since the founding of the organization, it's been a community effort to meet the needs of grieving children and families, and we've continued to expand our services through education and advocacy through the community, through things like this tonight, a webinar, and other educational offerings that we do in schools and nonprofits and faith organizations and the like. Just so you get a sense of our size and how many people we're serving, in 2016, we served nearly 800 people, over 300 families. We are a community-based peer support program. So one of the biggest misnomers about the organization is that we provide clinical counseling services. The reality is that we are not a clinical organization, but what we are offering are free and unlimited peer support services. And what that basically means is Good Grief as an organization recruits volunteers from communities throughout New Jersey to come and learn to be a facilitator. They go through a 36-hour training program, and then they run our nights of support with our families. And in those nights, we have goals and outcomes to build more resilient communities and children through play and through activities and workshops, things like that. So tonight, I'm going to transition into this conversation on grief and loss and handling expectations. I want to share with you our learning goals for those of you who like to know where we're going. I'm going to do a little intro to Good Grief, as I've already done, and then our approach to grief and loss, just so you have a sense of where we're coming from, our philosophy toward grief and loss. I'm going to discuss common cultural misconceptions related to grief, so we can put some of those to the side and move forward with a different view and perspective. I want to review components in the process of grief, highlight the impact of expectations, share strategies for managing expectations and interactions with others, and then at the end, I'll leave some time for Q&A. So some materials that you'll need this evening as your takeaway. I'm going to give you a little homework to go, just some paper and a writing utensil, and you'll find out more why. And you don't need that now, so no need to get up and scurry around to find it if you don't have it right in front of you. All right, so I want to start at the very beginning with no assumptions, just to make sure that we're all on the same page of where we're coming from when we're talking about grief. What is grief? Grief is a multifaceted response to loss. Grief is a compilation of emotions, but it's more than just emotions. Grief is an emotional, an intellectual, a spiritual, and a physical response. What do I mean by those things? So most often, grief is assumed to be an emotional response. When you hear people talk about grief, they say things like, oh, grief is sadness and anger and loneliness and frustration and isolation, depression, relief, all of those things that you can feel, those emotive responses to grief and loss. But I think it's important to acknowledge that grief is also an intellectual response. So we have to come to terms and fully understand the reality of that person or thing that we lost. And I'm going to get into a little bit more here in a minute about all the different types of losses that we can experience as human beings. It's also a spiritual response. And by spiritual, I don't mean kind of the hokey pokey spirituality. I also don't necessarily mean religion. By spiritual, I mean meaning making. So all of us, every single day, are walking around and we all are telling ourselves different narratives about our life and our story and how we are making sense of the world around us. So for me, my name is Jessie. I grew up in Washington State. My parents' names are Mark and Carrie. My sister's name is Anna Lee. And I grew up in a small farm town, and so all of that, the dynamics of a more conservative environment impacted how I grew up and where I find a sense of belonging and meaning. Also influenced where I went to college and what I studied. And then all of that influenced where I ended up going and studying for graduate school and what I'm doing with my life and my work. So as you can see, I'm beginning to share with you a little bit about my life story and narrative, and all of us have life stories and narratives, and the spiritual aspect of grief has a lot to do with that life story and narrative. How are you making sense of your life, and then how are you making sense of loss? Grief is also a physical response. So grief manifests itself in physical ways, in headaches and belly aches. For many people, they report feeling just this weight around their chest or shoulders, or just this constant drain on their neck. So many of us feel very physical responses to grief. Grief is a part of the universal human experience, so it touches all of those parts of us that make us human. Now, I also want to acknowledge that death is just one aspect or one form of loss that we can experience. So while I'm from an organization that works directly with children and families who have experienced the loss of the death of a parent or a sibling, there are many other types of losses we can experience as well. And I'm sure if I gave you a few moments, you could think of some of those and write some of those down. But I'm going to share our list that we use internally. So different types of losses. So death of a family, friend, pet, etc. Divorce, relationship, illness, accident, health, that could include some kind of diagnosis, job or financial security, safety, innocence, home, incarceration, deployment, and many others. And I think that this is important to acknowledge, not only for us tonight with this particular audience, but it's important to acknowledge that no one particular loss is necessarily better or worse than any other, that all of us are going to interact with and experience these losses in very different ways, even within the same family unit. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of that here in a second. But we can experience lots of different losses, and I know many of us come into this webinar tonight or into different experiences thinking about one particular loss. Maybe for some folks tonight it's the diagnosis that you have experienced. Maybe for others, it's the death of a friend or a family member. For others, a relationship. But I just want to kind of expand your horizons and to take into consideration all the different types of losses that you've experienced in your life. So what's going to determine how you will respond to grief and loss? A couple of things. The age of the individuals involved. So a 3-year-old is going to respond very different from, let's say, a 16-year-old or a 35-year-old or a 55-year-old. That 3-year-old is going to have a harder time understanding abstract concepts. There's going to be more challenges in communication with that 3-year-old. That 16-year-old is going to have a hard time getting some perspective, because as we all know, teenagers are great at getting perspective on their lives. That 55-year-old might begin to experience some form of midlife crisis. That loss might be in the midst of that. So all of us are going to be at different developmental milestones in our life, and that loss is going to interact with where we are and who we are. And so we'll respond in just very different ways. The type of loss, i.e., death, a broken relationship, health, diagnosis, etc. All of these different losses will bring out different responses in each of us. The nature of the relationships involved. So if it's a parent or a sibling, a grandparent, a distant relative who has experienced whether it be that diagnosis or there's been a death in the family or a broken relationship of some kind. It's not easy to imagine, or not hard to imagine, that if it's a very distant relative that lives out on the West Coast, that might not touch you as personally as someone in your immediate family unit or a caregiver who lives in your home on a regular basis. The personal characteristics of the griever will be another factor, and that includes things like their mental and spiritual health. So what kind of state of mental, spiritual, and we could add into that physical health is that individual in? Because that could determine how they will respond, how they will cope with loss. Family and cultural influences as well. So all of us come from different families, backgrounds, traditions, and cultures that have different assumptions and stigmas attached to all these different types of losses that we're talking about tonight. And all of those different cultural influences will certainly be at play. Grief is a psychosocial experience. And what I mean by that is grief is not just, grief doesn't just happen in a bubble where one individual experiences some kind of loss, that diagnosis, that death, the broken relationship, the loss of health, and that no one around that individual then impacts how they will grieve. It's quite the opposite. We live in a culture, in a context that has a lot to say about the different types of losses that we will grieve. So it's important to acknowledge that those cultural influences, those family influences will be at play. Any previous exposure to crisis, loss, and hardship will certainly have an effect, and this is a cascading effect. So researchers and psychologists have noted that when we experience one type of adversity in our lives and then another one comes along, they kind of cascade and snowball and become bigger and bigger, just like a snowball does when it's rolling down a hill. So the question is, in that previous exposure to crisis, loss, and hardship, how did that individual respond to that situation? Did they respond in a way that they experienced growth and were able to work through it and cope in healthy ways to that loss and in effect build resilience? Or did they respond by kind of pushing it to the side and trying to just keep moving forward with their day-to-day lives and not having any experience of growth and change through hardship? And the final one would be existing support systems. So what existing support systems do you have in your life? Do you have any? That certainly is a big factor to determine how someone will grieve and whether or not this cascading effect will occur. We'll talk a little bit more later about the importance of stable, caring relationships, but that is critical to this grief process. And so support systems are really crucial in how someone will respond. So the takeaway, the big takeaway from all of those different determinants of grief that I hope you have tonight is that everyone's grief is unique. I think oftentimes culturally, we expect that there should be certain patterns or ways of being, responses. But what we know about grief is that grief is such a unique organic process to each of us because we are all such unique individuals who respond in very unique ways. So even within a single family unit, we find that if there's been a similar loss, let's say it's a diagnosis, loss of health, a broken relationship, a death, even if it's been the same kind of loss in that one family unit, every single person in that family is going to respond differently to that loss. So everyone's grief is unique. So grief, it's often like the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's this big thing that most of us don't want to talk about. You know, I'm always amazed when people want to come to our different workshops and presentations on grief and loss, not because I don't think we provide some excellent resources and training, but it's just not a topic that most of us want to spend a lot of time thinking about. So grief is like the elephant in the room. And when we experience grief, lots of times as society, we don't know what to say, we don't know what to do. And so we're kind of left like these two individuals here trying to avoid this big elephant in the room. And this points, I think, to a culture of dysfunction, that we are a culture that is illiterate when it comes to grief and loss. And so we need to have an understanding of why it is that we live in this culture of dysfunction. What is this context that we live in, and where does that come from? Well, I want to start with a woman named Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross who are joining us this evening. If you haven't heard of her, I'm going to give you a kind of little rundown here. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was a Swiss psychiatrist who worked with terminally ill patients. And she worked with terminally ill patients for years. And she started to kind of develop a theory on different stages of grief that a patient would go through after they received their terminal diagnosis, something like cancer. And she published her findings in a book called On Death and Dying in 1969. And this book was groundbreaking. And Elisabeth Kubler-Ross is most famous for the 5 stages of grief. So even if you haven't heard of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, likely you've heard of the 5 stages of grief. Now, I think what's really interesting about Elisabeth Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages is that they've been grossly mistranslated and misused in our culture. So I want to say at the front end of this that we love Elisabeth Kubler-Ross at Good Grief. I mean, how could you not love this woman and her smiling face? But unfortunately, a lot of her work has been misinterpreted by our culture. And so what she meant for a theory on different stages of death and dying that a patient would go through after receiving a terminal diagnosis has since been translated into an individual who is grieving a loss of some kind or any kind is going to go through these 5 stages of grief. So if you don't know the 5 stages, these are them: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I just wanted you to think to yourself for a moment, what is potentially problematic about these 5 stages? Why might we think that these 5 stages are concerning? Let me give you some background and some context to why we think they're problematic. First and foremost, we find them to be problematic because the 5 stages have some different assumptions in them. First and foremost, they assume that everyone is going to go through these same 5 stages of grief and loss: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And secondly, they assume a linear progression. So there's a starting point when you've experienced loss of some kind in your life, and then you're supposed to go through this stage of denial, and then anger, and then bargaining, and then going through depression, and then finding acceptance or moving on or closure. And that everyone will go through this kind of linear progression. And so there's a beginning point, the loss, and then there's an end point with that acceptance. And another reason we find the 5 stages to be really problematic is this word acceptance. And again, this has oftentimes been misinterpreted from Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's work, but many times in our culture, we use words like acceptance, moving on, closure, healing, lots of other terms that are really problematic around grief and have a lot of assumptions behind them. And so for us at Good Grief, we don't like the 5 stages because it doesn't allow for this more organic, open-ended, unique nature of grief that I've already named through those different determinants a few slides earlier. The age of the survivor, the nature of the relationship, those existing support systems in their lives, all of those things are going to impact how that person responds. And so the 5 stages kind of puts a lot of pressure and constraints on individuals who are grieving. Because they look at this and they say, oh, well, I haven't really ever gone through denial, and I felt some anger, maybe some depression, but I definitely haven't come to acceptance. And for many individuals who are grieving, sometimes that first year after experiencing a loss is kind of just a fog where the reality hasn't fully set in yet for them. And then by year 2 or 3, that's when things get a lot harder. And so with this stage theory model of linear progression, whenever there's kind of backtracking in grief, if you want to call it that, or some hiccups in the road, then that becomes problematic and difficult for people. So we want to get rid of the stage theory model and use something different. And I have something to offer up for you tonight that you can use as a framework for understanding grief through 3 processes. Grief is, first and foremost, it's a thinking process. So to understand the reality and the permanence of the loss. So if it's that diagnosis, coming to terms with the reality that this diagnosis that we've received is a permanent one, and we're going to have to adjust to this new normal, whatever life is going to look like now. If it's a death, it's transitioning from life with this person to life with this person no longer being here. And one of the things I want to acknowledge that's important to us at Good Grief is that this is really difficult work, especially with children. And this goes back to the whole elephant in the room metaphor, that grief and loss are like the elephant in the room and that we don't want to talk about it. And I think especially true that we don't want to talk about it with children. And this is for good reason. We want to protect our kids, protect their innocence, try to keep them in that bubble of safety and security for as long as possible. But what's really problematic about that, about keeping them, trying to keep them from pain and hardship and loss and sorrow, is that it doesn't prepare them for when bad things happen. And I know we all like to think that we live in a world where bad things don't happen to good people, but I think all of us who are joining in tonight likely understand and know and have felt that that simply isn't true. And so at Good Grief, we advocate for talking openly about death, loss, pain, hardship, and sorrow with the kids that we work with. And we coach our families to be able to do that as well. And kids are they're not abstract thinkers. They're very concrete, literal thinkers. So kids, we have to adjust the way that we talk about loss and death and grief in terms that they're going to understand. Grief is also a feeling process. So expression of thoughts and feelings without judgment. And this is a really hard one for us. Again, as a culture, we're not very good at withholding judgment. We like to express our thoughts and our feelings and to let people know what they should or should not be doing, whether or not they are far enough along in this grief process, whether or not their expression of their emotion is inappropriate in this particular circumstance. Grieving people need to have space to express their feelings. And then grief is also a living and loving process. And yeah, I don't mean by living and loving that we just kind of all hug and get along and feel good, but rather it's about reinvesting in relationships and reinvesting in the future. Now, this is difficult because when we have experienced loss of some kind, we come to learn that if you love someone or something, whether that be someone who has died, I loved them and they're no longer here, or I loved my particular vision or expectations for the future, and now that is completely changed because of this diagnosis, or I loved the idea of this relationship that I was in, and now that's broken and changed forever. So when we lose those things, we can learn very quickly that it is painful to love, because love is very connected with loss. When you love someone or something, you can lose that person or that thing. So in grief, rather than this idea of acceptance and closure, it's about living and loving again, reinvesting in a sense of hopefulness for the future and in your relationships that are important to you in your life. All right, so a few paradigm shifts that I want to share with you that I think we need to make culturally that kind of help us to get out of this society of dysfunction that I've named that we live in around grief and loss. First, grief is not a problem to be fixed. And I think we often treat grief and loss as though an image or a metaphor that I like to use is, it's like there was a glass of wine or some other drink on a coffee table at a party, and somebody bumps it over onto a carpet and it stains the carpet. And the first thing everybody does is what? They go to, grab the towels and the napkins and try to blot it out and get rid of the stain and pretend like it never happened, it was never there, and just move on from it. And this is a lot like the way that we treat grief. Kind of tip this thing over, this bad thing happens, and we all just try to clean it up really quickly so that we can move on. And I think rather than trying to clean it up quickly and move on and pretend like it didn't happen, we need to have an understanding, real robust understanding, that grief and loss is a part of the human condition. Grief and loss is as much a part of life, part of being human, as joy, we're in relationships, family, and all of these things that we hold dear to us. So another assumption is that people are vulnerable. Now, what's attached to this assumption is connected with this idea of the elephant in the room, that if we bring up the conversation, if I name the grief or the loss that's taking place, that this person, maybe they'll just implode, they won't be able to handle it. This is especially true. We assume that if I have that conversation with kids, then they're not going to be able to handle it. And I think we have to start understanding that people are more resilient than we give them credit for. And in most cases, people are more hurt by the fact that you didn't bring it up, that you weren't willing to have that conversation, than if you did bring it up. And in most instances, the pain that they are feeling from the loss is much worse than any pain that you could inflict on them through the comments that you can make or the questions you could ask. Another assumption is that you should intervene only if necessary. And the assumption behind this is that we should only talk about this stuff, this grief, loss, pain, hardship, and sorrow, if everything is kind of imploding around us and things are falling to pieces. Rather, at Good Grief, we're working toward creating environments, communities, and organizations with more proactive engagement. So I'm working with schools regularly to help coach them on grief and loss, and to help them to get over some of their own discomforts on the topic, things that trigger them, and to encourage them to have more proactive conversations with students in their classrooms. Because we know that every single student who comes to their school is going to experience this at some point in their life. So it's about proactively engaging them to be able to equip them with the tools and the resources that they need. And the final assumption is that closure is the goal. This is connected to the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. That if we can just find acceptance or healing or closure, we'll be able to move on with our lives. I want us to shift our thinking to understanding that integration is the goal. So integration, this is a term that's used by folks in the field of post-traumatic growth. There are 2 researchers out of NC State named Tedeschi and Calhoun. If you haven't heard of them before, I encourage you to go check them out. They've got some books on Amazon, some great stuff online. And this is a term that they use for folks who have experienced post-traumatic growth. Now, I want to name and acknowledge that not all losses that we experience are necessarily traumatic, because trauma is perceived. It's a very subjective, highly individualistic response. But I think this is a really helpful term because it's a term that goes in this the same line that I was talking about earlier with narrative and making sense of who you are as a person in the world. So integration is all about that, taking this experience of loss and fitting it into your life narrative, your sense of meaning and purpose and existence. Now, I think it should also be recognized that integration isn't always like a go happy lucky thing, that we're not always going to feel great about the different experiences in life that we have to integrate into our life story. But it's a part of life, but it is a part of the process. So rather than closure, acceptance, and thinking that someday I'll come to a point where I'll just be able to move on from this, think about it a little bit differently, that we want to integrate this experience of loss into my life story. So I'm going to begin to shift our conversation into discussion on grief, loss, and expectations. Now I acknowledge the front end of this, that grief and loss happen within a context. And we've started to name some of the cultural contexts that we live in when it comes to grief and loss, the culture of dysfunction, and some of that history of some of why we live in that dysfunction. And that context brings a host of different expectations with it as well. So culture is going to have a lot of expectations around the gravity of your loss. How much should you feel this thing that you were grieving? To what severity should you be sad, angry, lonely, etc.? How should you respond? How quickly should you get over it? When you should come back to work? How long you should grieve? How you should move forward? Lots of different expectations that culture and people around you are going to have when it comes to grief. And I think we have to watch out for what we like to call, affectionately at Good Grief, the shoulds. Again, culture is going to have lots of things they think you should or shouldn't do when you're grieving a loss. You should be getting over it by now. You should be more emotional than you are. You should be talking to someone. You should keep it to yourself. You should be reaching out for more help. You should be doing more independently. You should be taking better care of yourself. You should be taking better care of others, and on and on and on. And you can see how some of these shoulds are even conflicting. And likely all of you who have experienced grief or loss in some kind have experienced these shoulds in some way. And I just want to say that expectations are tricky. Everyone has different expectations. You have a certain set of expectations of how life is going to be like, how you're going to move forward since your loss has occurred. Your kids have different expectations of the same. Your relatives have different expectations, friends, and others. And sometimes it's hard to get perspective in the moment. So I have a story about a family at Good Grief. There was a mom who, after a Thanksgiving break, came into a group one night and shared that, leading up to that Thanksgiving holiday, she had decided that she and the kids, her two kids, were not going to do the usual family tradition of going to the holiday dinner with the grandparents this year. Every year they had done it for as long as they could remember. They had gone to the grandparents' house for Thanksgiving. But since their dad had died earlier in that year, Mom decided that she needed to do something a little differently. And, she was worried about her own emotional response that would trigger memories and the experiences, and that she just wouldn't be able to handle it. And she really felt like she needed kind of a clean break from that, at least for this year, to do something different. And so she decided that she was going to, go ahead and say that, we weren't going to go to the grandparents this year. She thought that would be best for the kids, for herself, for everybody. And so she made that decision. Now, what she didn't know or didn't think about, didn't have perspective on, was that her kids had their own set of expectations. So the kids actually did want to go to the grandparents because, let's face it, they didn't want to be at home alone, just the two of them with Mom. Like, they felt like that would be pretty lonely. And the grandparents had their own set of expectations. They thought, the best thing for Mom and the kids right now is for them to come over for Thanksgiving so that we can be around them. And so they were offended and hurt by this as well. It's all different individuals involved with these situations that are going to come up for you going forward. Everyone is going to have different set of expectations of how you move on after loss. So I want you to consider these questions. Whose expectations do I care about the most? Whose expectations do I care about the most? And I'm guessing, most of us, that would be probably my family. And then what are the things that I can control? So whose expectations do I care about the most, and what are the things I can control? I think one of the things that can often happen when it comes to grief and loss, when we lose that sense of perspective, is that we're trying to manage kind of everything around us. We're trying to take care of ourselves, trying to take care of the kids, of our family and friends, and in the midst of that, kind of lose sight of what's most important. So whose expectations do I care about the most? What are the things that I actually can control? And I think it's important to acknowledge that you can't control your feelings. They just are. Feelings are pretty neutral things. Feelings pop up: the anger, the sadness, the loneliness, the isolation, despair, relief, joy, happiness, all those different emotions that we're going to experience when we are grieving. But we can't control those things. They just are. But you can control how you respond to that feeling. So I think an easy way for maybe you to relate to this is, I don't know if any of you have ever been driving down the road before and that song comes on the radio and all of a sudden it just takes you back to that person, place, or experience that you had years and years ago, and all of a sudden you get really emotional. Lots of families of good grief talk about, that smelling that perfume or cologne of their person who died, and all of a sudden it hits them like a ton of bricks and their emotions just come up for them. Now, they can't respond to those emotions that just come, or they can't control how that response of those emotions that just come up for them, but they can control how they're going to respond to that. So what's important for them and the things that we do to work with them in terms of their grief response is developing healthy coping strategies. So how can you develop a healthy response to those emotions that come up? You can't control the feeling itself, but you can control how you respond to it. You also can't control others' expectations. They just are. And I know we work hard at this to try to, control other people's expectations, opinions, and thoughts. But hopefully most of us know by now that these are things most of the time that we can't control. But you can control, again, how you respond to the expectations, thoughts, opinions of other people. So they're going to tell you they think you should do this thing. Now you can't control why it is that they're thinking that way, this outlandish piece of advice that they gave you, but you can control how you choose to respond to that particular piece of advice. So focus on what you can control and the expectations that you care about the most, and try to leave the rest behind. Who is most important? So this goes back to this question of whose expectations do I care about the most? How can I plan ways to meet the needs of my own family? And in order to do this, we have to open up dialogue. So after loss occurs, most frequently within the family unit, communication is the first thing that breaks down. So there's a loss in communication, and then on top of that, everybody starts operating in their own silo and is grieving differently. I already mentioned before how each person is going to respond uniquely, and that's true in a family unit as well. So in order to meet the needs of everyone in your family when experiencing a loss, you have to open up those lines of communication. And you have to actually go and ask and find out how your kid is doing, how your spouse is doing, how other relatives who are important to you are doing, and then find out what their needs are. So needs are very connected to different emotions we experience as humans. So we experience sadness or loneliness or frustration. And that's very connected to this experience of loss. So how can we help them to meet whatever that particular need might be? So if they're feeling isolated, maybe they need to be around other people. If they're feeling sad, maybe they need some alone time. Or maybe they need to be with someone else. We have to ask the questions if we're going to find out what their needs are. And also, how can I plan ways to meet my own needs? I engage in some self-care. And this is one with our parents and families of good grief that gets lost a lot in this whole grief process. That when I'm trying to run around meeting the needs of other people, managing other people's expectations, I've got my work, my family, all these other things going on, that oftentimes my own needs, my own practices of healthy self-care get lost in the process. And the problem with this is that if we don't engage in healthy levels of self-care, at some point you're going to experience burnout. So you can't pour from an empty cup. You can give and give and give and give, but at some point you're not going to be able to give anymore because you're going to be running on empty. So you have to find healthy ways of replenishing yourself, engaging in healthy self-care practices. Another thing that often happens in this whole grief and loss process or experience is loss of self-compassion. So a common result of hardship and loss is that there's this primary loss, the death, the diagnosis, the broken relationship, loss of health, etc., and then a cascade of effects, which are secondary losses. And secondary losses have a negative impact on different parts of our lives, including loss of self-confidence, and loss of self-compassion. So there's the primary loss, the diagnosis, the death, etc. And then that secondary loss is this loss of self-confidence, that I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know how I'm supposed to go forward. I'm not sure if I want to even stay at my job, if I just need to completely get a different job, if I need to move to a different part of the country, start all over again. But we tend to lose some self-confidence because our identity is very much wrapped into what we expected and hoped for the future. And now that thing has changed with this loss that we've experienced. And in that process, we also tend to lose self-compassion. So self-compassion is approaching yourself with the same kindness you would show to a friend. So we can get really hard on ourselves and be self-judgmental and have really high expectations of how I'm going to be getting people through this thing, not only myself, but dragging other people through this process of grief as well. So I have a suggestion that you have often heard: treat others as you would want to be treated. And one of the best ways that we can not only treat ourselves, but other people as well, is by following this platinum rule. And the problem with this saying of you treat others as you'd want them to be treated is, in grief, the way that you want to be treated may be completely different than somebody else. So when we're supporting other people who are grieving, the best thing that we can do is to treat others as they want to be treated. And again, this requires open lines of communication and actually going and asking the question, hey, how are things going for you since you've experienced X, Y, and Z thing? And what are some things that I can do to help you? Or simply saying and offering up, this is what I can do. I'm going to bring you dinner. I'm going to come over and just be with you for a little bit, even if you just don't want to talk. Showing up. To treat others as they want to be treated requires that we ask some questions. So I have a few tips for you to support someone who is grieving. First is that stable, caring relationships are most important. And research backs this, and our experience backs it as well. So if you go to developingchild.harvard.edu, there's a great resource on childhood development, and they've done a little bit of work on grief in there as well. And what they point to is that grief and loss have the same impact on the developing brain as abuse and neglect. And they connect this to stress. So positive stress is normal. Things like homework, tests, giving presentations, things like that, that we all experience some form of positive stress in our lives. It's a very normal and healthy thing. But continuous, long-term, toxic stress is problematic. So from sources like loss and grief, abuse and neglect, that's where we get toxic, long-term, continuous stress. And that includes things like increased levels of cortisol. And that increased levels of cortisol have long-term health effects on us, including obesity, anxiety, depression, greater risk of heart disease, and others. But what the research also shows, and this is really good news, is that the main thing that is needed in response to grief and loss to help upend this continuous toxic stress are stable, caring relationships. So what people need the most are for others just to show up and be willing to support you while you're grieving. Second, listen first. So if you're supporting someone who's grieving, oftentimes, and this is some of the culture of dysfunction that we live in, we feel the need to show up and start talking. So withhold your need to just say something because you feel like you have to. Really important to just listen first. Ask questions. Find out how they're doing. Hear what they're wrestling with before you jump in and try to give some piece of advice, just to say something. Talk about the person or situation, i.e. a diagnosis, broken relationship. Oftentimes I think we kind of beat around the bush and we aren't willing to name the particular situation, the person who died, their name, the diagnosis that's happened, that broken relationship. So make it personal. Use the names. Be specific about the circumstance. Because oftentimes that can feel isolating when people feel like you're kind of trying to avoid the topic a little bit by using non-specific terms. Don't try to fix it, because you can't. So grief isn't a problem to be fixed. As I've already mentioned before, it's a lifelong process to learn to live with. It's adjusting to this new normal. And then help that person to troubleshoot challenges and connect them to resources if needed, and especially if you're a professional working with children. So as I'm starting to wrap up here, I just want to highlight a few things from the presentation for you to take away. Grief it's not letting go, it's holding on in a new way. It's a normal, healthy part of the human experience. It's a lifelong process. It's not a problem to be fixed. We can't make it all better, but we can learn to be comfortable with other people's pain. And that's a big shift for us, to go from trying to fix this problem to clean up that spill that happened on the carpet to we have to learn to live with this new normal going forward. So I do have a little takeaway for you, a little reflection and writing activity. I would encourage you, as you walk away from this webinar tonight, to take even 5 minutes to reflect and write. And I want you to spend some time reflecting on your own experiences with grief and loss. So I named all the different types of losses that we can experience as human beings earlier in the presentation. And to keep those in mind, you can even click on the little PDF that has this webinar on there, and you can go back and review it. And think about all the different losses you've experienced. Who or what has been lost? How has that thing changed your life now and in the future? The best way others can help me is blank. Or if you're not here for your own loss, but you're here supporting someone else, maybe think about the best way that maybe I could help that other person is blank. Who can I reach out to for support? Or again, who can that person reach out to for support? And going back to this idea of stable, caring relationships being most important. And the reason I want you to do this is a couple of things. First, again, this idea of integration is vitally important to the grief process. And one of the ways that the folks, researchers who have done some work on trauma and growth have noted that integration happens really effectively is that if people have an idea of their own life story and narrative. And a way that we can do that is to spend some time either writing or talking. So if you're not into writing, you'd rather talk to somebody, then take these questions and go have a conversation with somebody. But if not, spend some time on your own writing and reflecting. In the midst of doing that, that process of reflecting back on your life, what you've experienced, you'll begin to create that life narrative of loss and grief and begin to pave a pathway for being able to build that integration to be able to move forward. So that's one reason to do it. The second reason is that there are a lot of folks in the field of resilience who've noted that actually only spending 5 minutes a day writing has a lot of health benefits for you. So it lowers your level of stress and anxiety in your life. It also helps you feel connected to other people around you. So it's a beneficial activity for the integration piece. It's also beneficial just for your overall health and well-being. Just want to check in on our learning goals before we transition into the questions. We did an introduction to good grief and our approach to grief and loss. I discussed common cultural misconceptions related to grief that included the stages of grief, review concepts and process of grief, or the components and process of grief, highlight the impact of expectations, and shared strategies for managing expectations and interactions with others. So now I'm going to turn things back over to the folks at the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome. But the last thing I'd say is that if you're interested in more information about our organization or looking for more resources, we have a great resource page. The handout you're getting tonight is one of many that are on there. The free downloadable resources, PDFs, videos, things like that on grief and loss. And encourage you to look into our organization more if you want to find out more about our work or want to get involved in some way. So thank you.
All right, Jessie, thank you very much. That was a lot of great information, and I'm going to delve right into some questions right now. Have a question having to do with cultural experiences. So, in your experience, does one culture seem to handle grief and loss, I don't want to say better, that was the question, better than another, but um, does how it's managed vary a lot across cultures? Let me put it that way.
Yeah, excellent question. In short answer, yes. So, uh, depending on the particular culture and values, yeah, they're going to handle the loss very differently. For instance, for some of the families that we work with at Good Grief, it's an inherent part of the culture and tradition that we go through a very formal ritual and process. And I'm going to speak specifically to death and loss here just based on my experience with our families, but to go through a very formal process of a burial, a funeral, and things like that. And there might be certain assumptions around that, even in terms of whether or not to include children in those particular rituals and traditions. And so for some of the families who we work with, there are a certain set of, traditions whereby it's a very formal process, and we go through these rituals of memorialization and burial, and then we don't talk about it again. And in fact, this goes to my point I made earlier, where we only talk about it when we need to intervene, when we see things kind of imploding around us. And I mean that to like the most extreme degree. And so not to kind of put all, I'm going to paint with broad brushstrokes here. I'm always very careful when it comes to different cultural traditions, because I want to be inclusive of different traditions that even comes out of those. But lots of Eastern cultures and traditions tend to be a little more formal in terms of those rituals, memorializations, and they also tend to not want to talk about it as much in the family unit. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but that's one of them. And some cultures and traditions that we work with at Good Grief do a lot more in terms of outward mourning or expression of grief. So a very kind of standard way of doing this is, let's say within the Jewish culture, they sit Shiva. And it's kind of an expected thing within that particular community and context that everyone from the community comes in at some point when they're sitting Shiva to participate in that in some way. So yeah, there are lots of different kind of, I guess, responses culturally that we see across, the families we work at Good Grief, and then when I go out and talk with folks in the community.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, here's another question that's kind of sort of on that same idea, a little bit anyway. So recently, this woman saying her husband's 80-year-old father died and was cremated. And that experience apparently was very upsetting to the 13-year-old son, who had only experienced a more traditional funeral and burial.
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts, and is this a common occurrence, number one, for there to be some upset around cremation versus a more traditional burial?
It's another good question. And it was a 13-year-old, is that right?
The 13-year-old boy is upset.
And was upset, yeah.
Because his experience had always been, a burial plot kind of thing.
Okay, so a couple of things I'm taking away from that. One of them is we advocate for, prepping kids, and that would include teenagers, for what they're going to experience when going through these different rituals and traditions and things like that. So cremation can be kind of a scary one for kids. Again, kids are very concrete and literal thinkers. So as a kid, you're thinking, oh my goodness, like they're putting this person that I love into this oven and baking them, and then these ashes are coming out. Well, is that going to be painful? Like, why are we doing that? And if kids don't have any kind of context to understand why it is that we're doing what we're doing, then yeah, that can be a really scary thing for them. So lots of times what kids need are just honest and open lines of communication. And so a good grief, I wouldn't say that it's common for us to experience kids to be scared by cremation. I think it's dependent on family to family. And I can't even say that having a conversation with that child before it happens will necessarily take away all of the fear, but I can say that having a conversation with them and opening up those lines of communication will certainly help.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the kids, I can't even tell you how many times at Good Grief who have, we do a lot of conversations throughout the year on funerals, and we have a little sand tray, and the kids take these little coffins and stuff, and they talk about their funeral experiences, and many of them talk about cremation or burying them in a coffin, and they get into all the logistics and details of what that means, and a lot of them want to know what cremation is because they don't know. And so while we might think that it's a potentially traumatic experience for them to hear and talk about that, kids they want to know and need to know some of the details, and not in a gruesome way, but in a way that will help them begin to understand, going back to that thinking process of grief.
Yeah, and so explaining to them as equivalent for their age, where they are
Yep.
chronologically, is going to make a big difference in exactly how much detail you need to go into
Yeah.
with that. Yeah.
And I would, the last thing I'd say on that is when talking to kids about death in particular, we go to biology a lot, and so helping kids to understand that that person going through, cremation, or if they're in a coffin, kids have questions about whether or not that person is cold or lonely. Kids need to understand that when the biology breaks down, the heart stops beating, the lungs stop working, that our brains don't work, and so we can't feel things or hear things or smell things. And because of that, they're not in any kind of pain. That's oftentimes what kids want to know, is whether or not that person is in any kind of pain.
Yeah.
So we can reassure them about that.
All right, good. Thank you on that. So I have a slightly different question now. So this lady is, assume it's a lady is a teacher in a third grade class. Recently, the older brother of a student in that class was killed in a car accident. It's probably too late now, but do you have any suggestions on how I might handle this or a similar situation when it happens again?
And I'm assuming how we might handle it in the classroom.
I'm assuming that's what she means. Yeah. Again, I'm assuming it's a lady, but yeah.
Okay.
So how you again? So I'm thinking here that what do you do? Do you ignore it? Do you talk about it? Do you? So
this is a great question, and a lot of the work I've been doing this year is kind of developing this new curriculum around how we handle these situations in classrooms, because I think oftentimes we're left ill-equipped to know how to respond. And so a couple of things I would say to that. One is before you do anything, before you say anything, make sure you have your facts straight. So one of the worst things we can do is to walk into a classroom and kind of make a declaration about what's happened, and then it turns out that, oh, well, I didn't have my information accurate. And then the kids find out that it's not accurate, and then they don't trust you anymore. So that's the first thing. Make sure you get your facts straight. Second thing, if you have a relationship with the family, make sure that you have permission from the family, to talk about it, at least in an extent that they feel comfortable with, depending on the nature of the loss. And then the last thing I would say is have a conversation about it. So open up those lines of communication. So when it happens, I'm not sure what the particular practices of the school were, if there was an announcement of some kind, but actually as a teacher being willing to walk into a room and say, hey, this thing happened, this death happened in our community. I think it's important that we acknowledge it. There's a family in our school that is grieving this loss. I want to create a space for us to be able to talk about it, because lots of times kids are going to have questions to ask, and those questions get left unanswered, or they're answered by friends who don't have the right information.
And
then they don't know where they can go for support. And so we need to open up those lines of conversations and normalize talking about death and grief.
That's great. And in this case, this teacher and the students in that class are going to have to be in close proximity to this child that just lost the brother suddenly.
Yes. Yep.
Which is a good segue into another question that I have. In your experience, is there any difference in the grief or loss that a family or an individual goes through between it being sudden and then it being um, I don't want to say long term, but
Like a terminal illness,
yeah,
expected.
something that
Yeah.
something that has gone on for a period of time.
Yeah. In our experience, this goes back to the assumptions around the gravity of the loss and how you'll take it, et cetera. A lot of that has to do with kind of cultural assumptions that, if it's a terminal illness, you expect it. The assumption is, well, at least you got to say goodbye. Or if it was a sudden loss, well, it must be so difficult that you didn't get to say goodbye. Or, well, at least they didn't go through any pain. There are always like the at leasts trying to put a silver lining on everything. And in our experience, in terms of someone's grief process, it's not easier or more difficult with either. It's really a question of, how that person is going to make sense of their loss. And again, each individual is going to respond differently to that. So while some people, it might be really comforting to get to say goodbye, for others, it's going to be really painful to watch the person that they love go through this terminal illness.
Yes,
So,
that's true.
yeah.
Okay, I have a question. So, is it common for parents who have a child with disabilities to feel like a sense of loss because they couldn't fulfill the dreams they had of that child? Both my husband and I never had these feelings, but many parents we know do. So, would
Another good
appreciate your
question.
comment on that.
Yeah, another good question. I would say, from my more limited exposure in this field, uh, I'd say it is fairly common, but not always common. And I've seen a little bit of voices on both sides where there's kind of been this movement among parents celebrating, uh, you know, the difference in their children, and wanting to kind of uphold the hopefulness they still have for the future, that life that they still have, and celebrating that life. And then we've also experienced parents who do grieve that loss, and I think that's really connected to those expectations for the future that I mentioned earlier. That
Mm-hmm.
if there is a loss to grieve, it's that I expected life to go this one way. I thought we were going down this one route, and then all of a sudden things are going to look and be very, very different. Um, and I would again go back to the uniqueness of every single individual. So, because my experience is more limited in this field, I can't provide probably as much insight as I can into the field of death and loss. But for my limited exposure, I would say, yeah, because everybody's different, um, I've seen both.
And also in that situation, you're dealing in a lot of instances, I would think, with siblings. So it's not just mom and dad in that situation. It's
Yep.
everybody is missing, is feeling like they're missing something. So it's a difficult situation for families.
Yep. Yeah.
I have another question about. Let me find it. Okay, so with so many young adults dying of accidental opioid overdose, is there an explanation of what has happened that you have found useful or effective in this situation for a child, to say to a child in this particular situation? Have you encountered that?
Yeah. I wish I had a good answer to this one. I get this question from time to time because I know it is a big epidemic, and I think because it's still so new and we're kind of in the midst of it, that we're still doing some learning along the way. So I want to acknowledge that. The thing I always come back to is honesty and truthfulness are really important for kids to understand what's going on. And so, again, this always has to be at an age appropriate developmental level. We don't need to scare kids or give them gross details and things like that. But I would always advocate for being honest with children. Um, there was a man named Michael Haney who wrote a book, and he's the editor of GQ magazine. And his dad died when he was young, and he was never told how his dad died. It was always a mystery to him. And he spent the good part of his teenage, young adult life trying to find out what happened to his dad. And this just became, obviously it became kind of an obsession, as it would, trying to find out the truth, and it took him a long time. And he ended up writing a book on it, about his whole process and journey of trying to find out what happened to his dad. And so, narrative is so important. And if we give kids a narrative that is inaccurate and untrue, then they're going to grieve that particular narrative. And then they find out the truth and trust breaks down. They're going to have to, integrate this whole new understanding of what happened in their life. So we had a family at Good Grief, a kid whose name was Zach, and his mom died, and she died of cancer. And the mom decided that she wasn't going to tell the kids how about her terminal diagnosis, that she wanted to protect them from it. And they just kept stretching that decision out further and further until it came time to when mom knew that she was going to die. And she made the decision, she and her husband, that they were going to tell the boys that mom was going away on a business trip. And mom never came home. Now you have to imagine being that kid, going through that experience and that breakdown of trust, and what you thought you knew about your parents, and all of that is gone. And on top of that, your mom is gone, or that person that's important to you. So the opioid crisis is a sensitive topic, and I know one that we have to be careful talking about with kids, but we have to help them to understand what's happened. And we need to, with the opioid crisis, also do our due diligence to understand all the other external variables that are at play in those situations. Educating ourselves and educating them on it as well.
Wow. Well, we've gone well over it, but I think I'd like to ask one more question, and I think this one will be a little lighter than the one we just talked about, so that might be good. What are some of the things that families should think about around the holidays?
Great question. Yeah. So the holidays are, Thanksgiving is just passed, and we've got holidays coming up here at the end of the year. And a couple of things that we like to talk about at Good Grief are, one, I know for grieving families, one of the big things that you hear all the time is how the holidays are so hard. And one of the things we're working hard to try to do with families at Good Grief is helping them to kind of re-find joy in the midst of the holiday season again. And so, or reimagine joy in new ways. This is part of, coming to terms with this new normal. So we've got a worksheet that we hand out this year on our website, actually, if people are interested in that, about planning ahead. And I would say one of the best ways you can kind of reimagine or find joy is to do some planning. So think about what are some holiday traditions or experiences in the past that made you really happy or connected with family, and decide together as a whole family, sit down and talk about it. Is this something we want to hang on to? Do we want to do it differently? Or do we want to do something entirely new since we've experienced loss over this past year? Planning ahead, we have found, is one of the most effective ways to kind of combat some of the blues that can often come up over the holiday season.
Well, holidays are so steeped in tradition in so many families. You do things a certain way. I remember being a kid, we all sat in the same chairs when we opened Christmas. I mean, everybody had a place. So it is a tough time. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm going to wrap it up, but I do have just a brief announcement I would like to make before I hand this back over to Kelly. And I'd like to just mention that this webinar tonight will be our final webinar for this year. So we will next be online on January 24th when Dr. Graham Hartke will present a webinar entitled, What a Difference a School Nurse Can Make. a Tourette Syndrome Guide for School Nurses. This webinar will launch the 10th year of our Wednesday webinar programming, and we felt that a special 10th anniversary tribute to school nurses would be an appropriate way to acknowledge the difference they can make in the life of a child with TS. This webinar will offer professional development credit to school nurses without charge if they attend the live webinar. In February, Dr. Martin Franklin of UPenn will present our 100th webinar, The TS Puzzle, How Do the Pieces Fit Together? We have a great webinar lineup for 2018, and I hope you will join us. On behalf of the entire NJCTS organization, I'd like to wish you all a wonderful holiday season and good health and happiness for the new year. Jessie, thank you. That was a really informative presentation. We appreciate your time and thank you for joining us. And I'll say good evening and now pass this over to Kelly.
Thank you for joining us on our webinar of grief and loss. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is now open and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our website. Our next presentation, What a Difference a School Nurse Can Make, presented by Graham Hartke, is scheduled for January 24th, 2018. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Jessie, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. Good night.